Out of all the foundations of emotional manipulation, sensory acuity is the one that has the most use outside of mind reading, mind control, and behavior manipulation. It doesn't matter what kind of person you are, where you live, or what your job is. If you hone your sensory acuity, it will help you in every aspect of your life. That's because sensory acuity is simply the aptitude of your senses. The better you can smell, taste, feel, hear, and see, the sharper your sensory acuity is. But this is only the general definition of sensory acuity. In the context of emotional manipulation and NLP, sensory acuity will make the difference between changing the subject's behavior successfully and failing to understand their motives completely. Effectively getting into someone's unconscious mind is often a matter of having enough information about them. Now, we aren't saying that information is the only thing that matters. Every foundation of emotional manipulation is crucial if you want to change someone's emotions in a way that benefits you. However, while it isn't sufficient to know everything possible about the subject, it is necessary. When people study the guiding principles of NLP, practice its techniques, and still fail, it is almost always because they didn't know their subject well enough. You can do everything right besides sensory acuity, and it won't be enough. You see, emotional manipulation may not be as complicated as you might think, but you still have to follow along with all the little things to succeed in it. Sensory acuity is one of those things. We put sensory acuity together with something called intel gathering. Intel gathering is nothing more than the information you get about the subject. Everything you learn about them helps you in the long-term goal of manipulating them. Some things might seem to matter little at the time, but bringing something up they mentioned can turn out to be the tipping point that gets them on your side. Once they are on your side, playing with their emotions is easy. For this reason, intel gathering is paramount to successful NLP. While intel gathering is the goal, sensory acuity is the means by which we achieve it. Use your nose to gain olfactory information. If they are the kind of person who always smells like perfume or cologne, you can infer things about them from that. If their voice sounds off, it probably tells you something is going wrong for them that day. Investigate the cause of the voice change and use it to your advantage. The list goes on, but the short version is this. The more you pay attention to the information your senses give you, the easier time you will have with NLP. Then there is the matter of how you sharpen your senses once you know how important they are in the task of manipulating someone. The key to doing this is not forcing your senses with your conscious mind. Your senses already know what they are doing. If you know consciously that you want them to pay extra close attention to your subject, they will do this on their own. But if you keep pushing your senses into your conscious level of thought, this will hinder your sensory acuity, not sharpen it. This is all to say not to overthink your senses. They already know how to see, hear, feel, and so forth without you dictating their every move. When you try to control everything your senses do, it makes them perform worse. All you have to do consciously on your part is remind yourself to pay attention with your senses before you spend time with the subject. From there, it will all come naturally. You will let your senses guide you instead of trying to guide them. In our book, we go further with the senses after you examine the human mind enough. The fact that we rely on more than 5 senses becomes apparent. We don't have just a 6th sense either. It is hard to put a concrete number on it, but we certainly have a dozen or more senses. Chapter 5 is where you will learn the developed skills of state control and sensory acuity in more detail. But while you are already thinking about the senses and how they will help you in your journey in emotional manipulation, we will list some of the other senses. The easiest way to remember these other senses is through association with the main 5 senses. Our first is empathy. You can associate this extra sense with touch because of the way you feel closer to someone when you touch them. You might not think of it as a sense, but consider what makes a sense a sense. Your smell, taste, touch, hearing, and sight are all senses, because they are your means of getting information about the world. Empathy fulfills this requirement of a sense. When we listen to someone tell a story about their day, we put ourselves in their shoes. We think about what it would be like to be like them. When we dive into persuading people with our words in Chapter 7, you will explore neuroscience in detail because of what it can surprisingly teach us about how to speak persuasively. We bring this up now because our lessons on neuroscience will take us to the topic of mirror neurons, which are the biological mechanism of empathy. Look forward to that chapter if you really want to hone your sense of empathy. Our next sense can be associated with taste because it also uses your mouth. This is the sense of verbal language. You might think of spoken speech as something you put into the world yourself rather than a sense in its own right, but consider how we experience other people talking. If we are paying attention, the meaning of their words comes to us naturally. We don't think hard about what each of their words mean. We simply absorb the information just like we would absorb the scent of a rose through our sense of smell, or a solo played by an oboe through our hearing. This is what makes verbal language a sense as well. Now, we did say that each extra sense could be associated with one of the 5 traditional senses, but this next sense is an exception. It does not fit perfectly with taste, but it is the other side of the coin for verbal language. This is the sense of nonverbal language. The other foundation of emotional manipulation go into this subject in greater detail. The other foundations also go into verbal language in more detail. Later chapters dive deeper into these subjects as well. In the context of sensory acuity, know that the sense of nonverbal language is how we get information from the subject's eye contact, posture, body language, tone of voice, and of course, emotion. These are only the main areas of nonverbal communication. There can be others. Just like with the sense of verbal language, this one is a sense because we get information from it unconsciously, without even thinking about it. When someone's voice suddenly gets softer, we take that to mean they are telling us something private. When someone has been slouching and straightens their posture around us, we can tell they are trying to appear more confident. These are pieces of information we get through nonverbal communication that we do not work for. Since it is a sense, our nonverbal communication picks up on it for us unconsciously. Our next extra sense is similar to our sense of smell. Think of what your nose does. You can use it to tell when food is spoiled, to detect when something is burning, or to know if someone smokes because of the smell of tobacco on their breath. The sense of smell often goes less appreciated than it should be, but when you think about it, it is the sense that ties us the most to our instinctual, animalistic side. Because this is why the sense is frequently neglected as a means of obtaining information, because we want to think of ourselves as better than animals. But the truth is, animals can use their senses in a much more advanced way than we can. For example, bats and dolphins use echolocation to observe their surroundings by sending out small sound waves and detecting how they come back. It isn't very good or useful for us humans, but we technically can use echolocation. Echolocation is nothing more than feeling sound instead of hearing it. To test this out, put your hand a decent distance in front of your face and speak towards it at a good volume. You might not want to do this when other people are around, of course. You were able to feel the sound waves on your hand separately from the mere air from your breath. We bring up echolocation because it is one of the many senses humans have that they don't realize. So far, we have gone over the extra senses of empathy, verbal language, and nonverbal language. The one linked to your smell can be called instinct. Your instinct is your basic gut feeling. It is a sense because it can give us information without us putting any conscious effort into it. While gut feelings can be useful to a life-saving degree, it can also be the easiest to misinterpret. Indeed, sometimes our gut feeling may think that something is wrong based on a bias or a misunderstanding, but you can still use it as part of your sensory acuity toolkit as long as you are aware of its imperfection. The second to last extra sense we will get into can be associated with your hearing. It is easy to hear and understand the literal meaning of words. But what can be harder is understanding deeper meaning and subtext. Now, it might sound like we're getting into an English literature lesson, but the truth is, knowing the deeper meanings and subtexts of things is useful in real life too. We can call this extra sense insight. Insight can help you considerably in emotional manipulation. Where a lot of NLP aspirants go wrong is taking this extra sense to mean trying to sound smart. This is not what the sense of insight is about at all. Honing your insight gets easier as you learn more about NLP, because as you get deeper into this forbidden discipline, you realize the implications of the similar structure of individual human brains. There is still plenty of time for you to go deep into this sense, but we can give you the basics while you are here. Think about what happens when someone tells a joke. They will have a punchline at the end that everyone laughs at. Believe it or not, the sense of insight comes into play in this interaction. Everyone laughs at the joke because they see the layer of meaning beneath the surface, and that's where the humor comes from. If you can only understand the literal meaning of things, if you don't have much of a sense of insight, you don't understand many jokes because you don't understand the significance. A good joke teller knows what references or subtext the listeners will pick up on. They can't explicitly say what the subtext is, because then it wouldn't be subtext, which totally ruins the humor that results when you realize what the deeper meaning is and laugh. Take the following joke. What did the Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Notice how insight is required for someone to laugh at this joke? You need to understand two things: that people can order hot dogs with everything, and that Buddhists believe in the interconnectedness of everything. In examples like this, we can see how insight seems too natural that we don't even think of it as insight. We just think of it as obvious. In fact, you might look at this joke and think it doesn't sound like insight at all. You might think, everyone knows what a hot dog with everything is, and everyone knows why a Buddhist would say something like that. This isn't insight, but it is insight. It is just insight so tightly woven into your psyche that you don't even think of it as a deeper subtext. With the hot dog vendor, remember that the only literal thing we know about them is they are a person who sells hot dogs somewhere. We don't know anything else from this surface level definition of a hot dog vendor. It is insight to know what makes up a hot dog with everything means. The joke is funny because it takes commonly used expression that has a different meaning when coming out of a Buddhist's mouth. With the Buddhists, it's more obvious why insight is required to understand the joke. Someone who didn't know anything about Buddhist beliefs wouldn't think the joke was funny at all, because they would just think they were ordering another hot dog with everything on it. A well-developed sense of insight will help you understand what your subtext is trying to tell you when they aren't explicit about it. If you pay attention to your own behavior, you will catch times when you are talking to people and you want to tell them something, but you can't tell them outright because you are embarrassed or for some other reason. Other people want to tell you things too, and if you aren't paying enough attention to your sense insight, you will just miss it. There are certain extra senses besides the ones we cover in this book, but these are the ones that will help you the most in NLP. The last one we cover is simply your sense of imagination. You will realize the full potential of your imagination when you read more about the different networks of the brain when we get deeper into neuroscience. For now, you should know that your imagination is much more than the way you imagined fairy tale creatures and imagined being a grown-up when you played house as a kid. When you get down to the details of the brain, you learn that imagination is anything your brain does in a network called the default mode network. As we said, there is a lot to learn about the brain that you are not ready for yet. But the default mode network is the opposite of your other main network, the executive functioning network. Your default mode network is where you think about what will happen later, what has already happened in your life, how you think about yourself, how you think about others, and how you think about the world. The executive functioning network is the opposite of the default mode network because it is the network of your brain that deals with everything in the moment. When you ride a bike, you are using your executive functioning network. because it is made to do things, not think about things. You don't only use the executive functioning network for movement though. You use it for anything that requires you to pay attention to the task at the moment. That includes reading and listening too. One way to think about it is this. When you are reading a book, your executive functioning network is the network that is doing the work of taking in the words as pieces of information. Your default mode network is what you use to take these pieces of information and put meaning to them. The default mode is also where you form your own thoughts about what you are reading. Do you think the story is good? Bad? What do you think about the actions of the main character? And so on. You may be wondering what we mean when we call the default mode and executive functioning networks. We won't use this section to talk much about the microscopic structure of the brain. It is actually rather simple. Your brain is a mass made from billions of neurons, brain cells, connected to one another with links called synapses. But these synaptic connections between your neurons are not equally distributed to all areas of the brain. Networks are parts of your brain that are highly connected because they are responsible for a certain task. The executive functioning network is highly connected with synaptic connections that help you pay attention to tasks in the moment. The default mode network is responsible for making connections when you think about yourself, the world, the future, and so forth. There are other networks too, and we will get into those later. But we bring up the default mode network and the executive functioning network because of the role in the default mode plays in imagination. Your executive functioning is also important to talk about because it is the direct opposite of your imagination. Another clear way to separate these two networks is by looking at the idea of awareness. When you are using the executive functioning to clean yourself in the shower or when you sort laundry, you are aware of the self-cleaning or the laundry sorting. For our purposes right now, let's say you aren't thinking about anything else while you are doing these things. You are simply in the zone while you are taking a shower and sorting your laundry. This is your executive functioning in its purest form. You aren't thinking about anything else, so you are only aware of the task you are doing. The default mode isn't responsible for your awareness of the tasks you are doing in the real world. Instead, it is responsible for mapping out your abstract thoughts and making them stronger when you use them more. We already told you what kinds of things you think about with your default mode, so take a guess at what kind of awareness you achieve with the default mode. If you guessed self-awareness, you are right. Your executive functioning is the physical network being used in your brain when your awareness, your conscious experience, is the task you are doing. Your default mode network is being used when your awareness is the thoughts you are having about your life, who you are, philosophical questions, the past, and so on. To put it simply, your executive functioning network is used when you are in a state of awareness, while your default mode network is being used when you are in a state of self-awareness. There is still a lot to talk about on this subject, but for now, we have to return to how the default mode network works into your sense of imagination. And this is something that ties all of your senses together, both the traditional senses and the extra ones. The reason your sensory acuity is so crucial to your effective manipulation is that your executive functioning network and your default mode network both speak the same language. They may perform very different tasks, but there is one thing they both use in exactly the same way. Senses. Sensation is the language both your default mode network and executive functioning speak. That means to become gifted in the extra sense of imagination, you have to bring in senses you experience through your executive functioning and imagine experiencing them again with your default mode network. Every sense we cover here matters a great deal, but your sense of imagination is the one you always have to use as an emotional manipulator. If you didn't use your imagination, you wouldn't be able to mind read, mind control, or manipulate anyone. They would simply enter your awareness through your executive functioning, and nothing about them would change. When you want to change something about a person's beliefs or behaviors, you have to use your imagination to see how they could be different. If you can't imagine what you want our results with the subject to be, you won't be able to change them at all. Imagination is the sense an emotional manipulator uses to establish a vivid goal for themselves when it comes to how they want the subject to change. We connect this extra sense to the traditional sense of vision because both senses share this vividness. While there are sensations you can experience with all the other senses that can be intense, sight and imagination are the two senses that fully captivate us. This is why TV shows, movies, video games, and all visual media are so addicting. Their vividness is absolutely hypnotizing. Even though all these senses must come together for you to have strong sensory acuity, this vividness is something that only vision and imagination can accomplish. Besides envisioning your goal with the subject, there is a second important use for imagination. Not only do you have to use your own imagination to see how the subject can change, you need to capture your subject's imagination. You need to make them see how they could be different. Once you accomplish this, your job as a manipulator comes easy. There's a lot more to come about how you can capture the subject's sense of imagination in this book, so keep reading to learn more. We will go into greater detail on how to develop all the senses, both the traditional 5 senses and the extra senses. Now you have a good idea of sensory acuity before getting into the third foundation. The third foundation is unconscious communication, making our discussion of the sensory acuity a perfect segue. While you need excellent state control and sensory acuity to even get started with emotional manipulation, unconscious communication gets into the first real stage of practicing NLP on your subject. It is the stage in which you are currently in conversation with them, when you sharpen your sensory acuity and develop your state of control. This should be done before you ever attempt to emotionally manipulate the subject.